I was 12 the winter the Doyle family came down off the freight road, and I have told this story so many times that my grandchildren roll their eyes when I start. But I was there. I saw it with my own two eyes from behind the counter of my uncle's trading post in Cold Fork, and I will tell it the way it happened, not the way the pretty version goes. That country was hard. People who never lived in the high passes don't understand what hard means. It isn't just cold. Cold you can fight. It was the kind of place where the mountains stood over you like they were waiting for you to make a mistake. Pine going up forever. Wind that came down the river valley at night and rattled the shutters till you thought the building would lift off its stones. We had maybe 40 people in Cold Fork, and most of them were the sort who'd come west to get away from somebody, so they weren't soft. It was late in the year. The aspens had already dropped their leaves and the first real snow was sitting up on the peaks like a warning. My Uncle Pell, who raised me after my folks passed, kept saying the same thing every morning while he checked the sky. "She's coming early this year. I can smell it." He had a way of smelling weather that nobody could explain. He was right about that winter, too. It came mean and it came fast. I remember the afternoon the wagon came in because I was sweeping the floor and I'd been at it an hour, and I was bored enough to look up at every sound. Most days nothing came up that road that late in the season. The freighters had already made their last runs. So when I heard wheels and a tired animal blowing, I went to the window. It was a small wagon, not a proper settler's outfit, just a light farm wagon with a canvas that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt. One mule, and that mule was done. Its head hung low and its ribs showed. Up on the seat sat a woman, and behind her, peeking out from under the canvas, two small faces. She pulled up in front of the post and just sat there a moment. I think she was gathering herself. Then she climbed down slow, like her body hurt, and she came inside. I'll tell you what I noticed first because it wasn't her face. It was her hands. She had her gloves off and her knuckles were cracked and bleeding from the cold and the rains, and she kept them half closed like she was ashamed of them. She was maybe 30. Could have been less. Hard country puts years on a person. She had dark hair pulled back tight and her coat was a man's coat, far too big, and I understood right away whose coat it had been and that he wasn't with them anymore. "Afternoon," she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I'm looking for a man named Carver. I was told he keeps a boarding house here." My uncle came out from the back. He looked her over and he looked out the window at the wagon and the two children, and something in his face went careful. "Carver moved on 2 winters back," he said. "Took the stage out and never came back. The boarding house is shut." She didn't react much. She just nodded slow like she'd half expected it. "Is there anyone in town who lets rooms or takes in folks for the winter? I can work. I'm a fair cook and I can sew, I can do laundry, I can keep books, She stopped herself. I think she heard how she sounded. "How many of you?" Pell asked, gentle. 3, me and my 2. My boy's 8, my girl's 6. She wet her lips. "My husband took sick on the Platte. We buried him outside Fort Laramie in September. We were headed for his brother's place in the Bitterroots, but the snow's already closed the high pass and we can't make it through before spring." That word buried, she said it plain, no shake in it, and that was somehow worse than if she'd cried. A person who can say buried without crying has already cried all the way out. My uncle was quiet a long moment. Then he said the thing I'd hear a dozen times over the next 2 days in a dozen mouths. "Ma'am, I'd help you if I could, but I've got no room and a hard winter coming and a wife who's poorly. Truth is, nobody up here's got the room for 3 extra mouths through a season like the one Pell's been smelling." He tried to soften it. "There might be folks down the valley, or back the way you came if you turn around quick." "There's nothing back the way I came," she said. "I know I came that way." She bought a little flour and some salt pork with coins she counted out of a cloth she untied carefully, like every coin was an argument she was losing. She didn't ask for charity. I want that understood. She never once asked for a thing she didn't try to pay for. When she went back out, the little girl had climbed down to stretch and was standing by the mule, patting its leg. The boy stayed up on the seat, watching everything, the way a boy watches when he's decided he's the man of the family now and it's killing him. I'll never forget how that boy looked. Too still, like he was holding the whole wagon together by sitting straight. That was Thursday. By Friday, everybody in Cold Fork knew about the Doyle widow because that's how a small place is. And by Friday, everybody had also worked out their reasons. The Hendersons had the room but 6 of their own. Old Mrs. Tilly would have taken the children but couldn't feed them. The Reverend, if you could call him that, said a great deal about Christian duty and did nothing. The blacksmith said straight out he wasn't running a poorhouse. Each of them, in their own way, said the same word: no. She stayed 2 nights in the wagon at the edge of town by the river, where she didn't have to ask anybody. I know because I carried a bucket of milk out to them Saturday morning on my own without telling Pell, and I felt sick the whole way there because I was a coward about it. I just set it on the wagon gate and mumbled something and ran off. But I saw inside. The 2 children were wrapped in everything they owned, and she had her arm around both of them. And she was feeding the small fire with broken bits of crates so careful, 1 stick at a time, because she knew exactly how little she had to burn. That night the temperature fell like a stone down a well. I remember it because Pell got up twice to bank the stove, and the second time he stood at the window a long while, and he said low to nobody, "That river bottom'll be 10 below by morning." And then he didn't say anything else, and I knew he was ashamed, and I knew he was going to do it anyway, the not helping, because that's what fear does to good people. It makes them practical. Now I have to tell you about Silas Vance, because Sunday is when he came down, and you can't understand Sunday without him. Vance was a mountain man, a trapper mostly, though he hunted and traded too. He lived alone up Bitter Creek, maybe 9 miles above the town, in a cabin he'd built with his own hands out of timber he'd felled himself. He came down to Cold Fork 4-5 times a year, no more. Sold his furs, bought powder and lead and coffee and salt, and went back up before anybody got too comfortable around him. People were a little afraid of him, and I'll be honest, so was I, but not for any good reason. He was big. Not fat, there wasn't a soft inch on him, just big the way a door is big, shoulders that filled a frame. He had a beard going gray and pale eyes that didn't move around much, and when they landed on you, you felt landed on. He didn't talk unless he had something to say, and most folks find that unsettling, because most folks talk to fill the air, and a man who doesn't makes them nervous about all the talking they do. There were stories about him. There are always stories about a man who lives alone. Some said he'd been a soldier and seen something that broke him. Some said he'd had a family once down south and lost them, and that's why he went up the mountain. Some just said he was strange and left it there. I don't know which were true. I learned later that the kindest people often carry the heaviest stories, and they keep them up a mountain because the stories are too heavy to carry into town. He came in Sunday a little before noon. I heard the door and looked up, and there he was, snow on his shoulders, a pack of furs over one arm filling the doorway. He stomped his boots and came to the counter and laid the furs down without a word, and Pell started going through them, the way they always did, slow and serious, 2 men who respected the work. And while they were at it, Vance said, not looking up, "Whose wagon is that down by the river?" Pell's hands went still for just a second. "Widow," he said. "Doyle come up off the Platte, husband died. She's got 2 little ones." "How long she been camped there?" "3 nights now." Vance was quiet. He ran his thumb along the edge of a beaver pelt. "3 nights," he said, "in this." "Nobody's got the room, Silas." Pell said it fast, like he was getting ahead of something. "It's a bad year, we can't all." "I didn't say anything," Vance said. But he had. He'd said it without saying it, the way he did everything. He finished the trade. He bought his powder and his coffee and a sack of beans, and I noticed, twice the flour he usually took, and a small tin of the hard candy we kept by the register that I had never once seen that man so much as glance at. He paid. He gathered it up. And then he stood at the counter a moment longer, looking out the window at the river, and I watched him decide something. He didn't announce it. He just walked out and got on his mule and rode down toward the river bottom, and I, being 12 and nosy and unable to stand not knowing, told Pell I had to fetch water and followed at a distance. That's how I came to see the part everybody in Cold Fork would be arguing about for 20 years. The river bottom was white and hard that Sunday. The cold had a sound to it, if that makes sense, a kind of ringing silence, where every little noise carried too far. The widow's fire was almost nothing, just a thread of smoke. The mule stood with its back to the wind. The children were inside the wagon. I crouched behind a stand of willows maybe 40 feet off, freezing, and I watched Silas Vance ride up and stop. He didn't get down right away. He sat his mule and looked at the wagon and the dead-looking fire and the whole sad little camp, and the widow came out from under the canvas with her chin up, ready to be told to move on, because by then that was the only thing strangers said to her. "Ma'am," Vance said. "Mister," she said back, careful. There was a silence. He wasn't good at this part and you could see it. A man who lives 9 miles from the nearest voice doesn't get much practice at the gentling words. Finally he said, plain, "It's going to be 20-30 below by tonight. River bottom's the worst place to be. Cold pools down here. You'll lose the children before morning, or your feet, or both." The widow's face didn't move. "I'm aware of the cold, sir." "I know you are." He looked at his hands on the reins. "I'm not telling you to leave. I'm telling you the river bottom is a bad place, and there's a worse night coming, and I've got a cabin up Bitter Creek that's tight and warm, and there's only me in it." I watched her understand what he was offering, and I watched her get angry, which surprised me at the time. She drew herself up. "I don't know what you've heard about me, mister, but I'm not." "I haven't heard anything about you," Vance said, and he said it so flat and so true that it stopped her. "I heard there's a woman by the river with 2 children, and that nobody in that town would take you, and I came down to see if it was so. That's all I heard." The wind moved through the willows. I held still. "You don't know me," she said, quieter now. "No, ma'am." "You don't know my children." "No, ma'am." "Then why?" And here is the part I have carried my whole life, because I was 12 and I didn't have words yet for what I was seeing, but I felt it land in my chest like a stone in still water. Silas Vance was quiet a long moment. Then he said, "Because I had a wife once and a girl down in the Tennessee hills, and there was a winter I couldn't get them what they needed, and I lost them both inside of 1 week. Fever. I was away trapping when it took them. I came home to a cold house." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I climbed up this mountain to get away from people, ma'am, and I have been a long time learning that you can't run high enough to get away from a thing like that. It just waits for you to come down." The widow had her hand over her mouth. "I don't have much to give," Vance said. "I'm not asking anything of you. You can have my cabin and my fire and my food, and I'll sleep in the lean-to with the animals. I don't mind it. I've done worse. Come spring, when the pass opens, I'll take you up to your brother-in-law's myself with supplies, and you'll never have to see my face again if that's what suits you. But I'm not going to ride back up that mountain and sit by my warm fire knowing there's 2 children freezing in a river bottom, because every coward in Cold Fork found a good reason to look away." He paused. "I've done enough looking away to last me. I'm not doing it again." She started to cry then. Not loud, just her shoulders going and her hands still over her mouth and the tears running down those cracked knuckles. And she whispered something, and the wind almost took it, but I was downwind and I caught it. "Nobody will take us," she whispered, like she was telling him a fact about the world, like she'd learned it the hard way and didn't expect it to change. And Silas Vance got down off that mule slow, and he stood there in the snow with his hat in his hand. I never once saw that man take his hat off, not in church, not anywhere, and he said, gentle. So gentle it didn't seem possible, coming out of a man that size. "I will." That was it, 2 words. I have heard a great many words in my long life, sermons and speeches and wedding vows and deathbed confessions, and I have never heard two words do more work than those two words did in that frozen river bottom. I will. She cried harder for a second, and then, because she was a practical woman and the cold was real, she pulled herself together and wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, "I can cook. I'll earn our keep. I won't take charity, You can cook," Vance agreed, putting his hat back on. "And I'll be glad of it. I've been eating my own cooking 9 years and it's a misery. But that's not charity, ma'am. That's just two people in a hard winter being some use to each other. Now let's get these children up the mountain before dark." I scrambled back to the post before they could see me, and I was crying too, the cold kind of crying where it freezes on your face, and I didn't even know exactly why. By the time I got back, the news was already moving through town because somebody'd seen Vance ride down. And here's the thing about people. The moment Silas Vance did the brave thing, every coward in Cold Fork found a way to make it about themselves. The blacksmith said it wasn't decent, a lone woman going up to a lone man's cabin. Mrs. Tilly clucked about reputation. The Reverend, who had done less than nothing, got real interested in the moral hazard of the situation. 2 days they'd watched a widow freeze and found it sad but practical. Now that a man had done the right thing, suddenly everybody had opinions about how he'd done it. My Uncle Pell didn't say a word in any of it. He just stood behind his counter looking out at the river, and that night he was quiet at supper, and finally he set down his fork and said to me, "I'll tell you something, boy, and you remember it. There's two kinds of people in this world, the kind that find a reason and the kind that find a way. I found a reason." He looked old when he said it. "Vance found a way. Don't you grow up to be the reason kind. You hear me?" I said I heard him. I have tried to keep that promise my whole life. I haven't always, but I've tried. The widow and her children went up Bitter Creek that Sunday afternoon, and the storm came that very night, just like Pell smelled it would. It came howling. It buried Cold Fork to the second-floor windows, and it didn't let up for 3 days. People said afterward, in the careful way people say things when they want credit for what they didn't do, that those children surely would have died in the river bottom. They said it like a fact they'd always known, instead of a fact they'd watched coming and chosen to ignore. I thought about that wagon by the river every one of those 3 storm days. I thought about how that woman fed her fire one stick at a time. And I thought about a big quiet man who'd lost everything once and climbed a mountain to forget it. And how, when it came down to it, he was the only one who remembered. We didn't see any of them for the rest of the winter. The pass to Bitter Creek closed up tight. Now and then somebody'd say they'd seen smoke up that way, good thick smoke, the kind that means a fire well fed and a chimney drawing right. And I'd feel a warmth in my own chest, picturing it. The cabin tight and warm. The children fed. A woman cooking at a stove she'd earned the right to stand at. And a big man sleeping out in the lean-to with the mules, by his own choosing, content as I'd ever known him to be. Because for the first time in 9 years, his cold house wasn't cold anymore. People wanted to make it a scandal. The mountain wouldn't let them. You can't gossip across a closed pass. So all winter the talk had nothing to feed on, and it died, the way fires die when you stop putting sticks on them. And come spring, when the snow let go and the creek came roaring down full of melt, we found out what that winter had really been. The pass opened in late April that year, later than most. The town had a way of holding its breath until the first wagon came through, and that spring the first thing that came down off Bitter Creek wasn't a wagon at all. It was Silas Vance, on his mule, alone, riding into Cold Fork the way he always had, with a pack of winter furs and a list in his head of what he needed. The whole town pretended not to watch him. The whole town watched him. He came into the post and laid down his furs, and Pell went through them, slow and serious, same as ever. And the whole time there was a question sitting in the room that nobody had the nerve to ask, and finally my uncle, who I think had earned the right by being honest with himself all winter, asked it plain. "The Doyles," Pell said, "they wintered all right." Vance ran his thumb along a pelt. They wintered fine, he said. Boys grown 2 inches. Girls got color in her face. Mrs. Doyle kept that cabin so clean I hardly knew it for mine. And you're taking them up to the brother-in-law's then. Now the pass is open. Vance was quiet a moment. That was the plan, he said. Was, Pell repeated. And Silas Vance, who never explained himself to anybody, set down the pelt he was holding and looked out the window, the same window he always looked out, and he said, I wrote the brother-in-law over the winter. Sent it down with a trapper coming through in March. Told him his sister-in-law and his nephew and niece were safe and well, and asked his intentions. He paused. He wrote back. Said he had 11 of his own and a poor claim, and he was sorry but he couldn't take on 3 more. Said he'd always reckoned they'd be better off turning back east anyhow. The room was quiet. So there's nobody up the Bitterroots waiting on them, Pell said. No, Vance said. There never really was. She was riding to a door that was already shut. She just hadn't gotten there yet to hear it. I remember thinking how terrible that was. That woman had buried her husband and crossed half a territory in a patched wagon, headed the whole time toward a place that didn't want her, and she didn't even know it. She'd have made that whole hard road for a closed door if the river bottom hadn't stopped her first, if the cold hadn't stopped her, if Silas Vance hadn't come down the mountain. What'll she do? Pell asked. And here is where the big quiet man surprised the whole town one last time, and surprised me most of all, because I was old enough by spring to half understand it. She'll stay, Vance said. If she'll have me proper, I asked her. Not out of pity, I want that understood, and I'll say it to any man who wants to make it ugly. I asked her because that cabin's been a warm place all winter for the first time in 9 years, and a man's a fool to send warmth back out into the cold on purpose. He picked his furs back up off the counter. She said she'd think on it through the spring. Said she wouldn't be taking it out of need, that if she stayed it'd be because she chose to and not because she had nowhere else. I told her that suited me fine. I told her I'd rather be chosen than needed any day of the week. My Uncle Pell, who was not a man given to feeling out loud, reached across that counter and shook Silas Vance's hand, and held it a second longer than a handshake usually goes, and said, You're a better man than this town, Silas. The whole lot of us put together. No, Vance said. I just had less to be afraid of. I'd already lost the thing a man's afraid of losing. That's not goodness. That's just freedom that came the hard way. And he put on his hat and he rode back up the mountain. They were married that summer. Not in the church. The Reverend made some noise about it and Vance didn't bother answering him, but out by Bitter Creek, by a circuit preacher who came through in July and didn't ask anybody's permission to do a kind thing. Half the town went up for it, the same half that had found reasons all winter, dressed in their good clothes and acting like they'd been rooting for it the whole time. People are like that. They love a happy ending best when they can pretend they helped write it. I went too. I was 13 by then, and I'll tell you the picture I carried home and have kept all these years. The widow Mrs. Vance now stood up by the creek in a plain dress with her hair down for once, and she didn't look hunted anymore. The hunted look was gone clean out of her face. The boy stood beside Vance, straight and proud, and you could see the man already teaching the boy the things a father teaches, how to stand, how to be still, how to be of use. And the little girl had Vance by one enormous finger, just holding it, the way she'd held the mule's leg that first cold day, and Vance kept glancing down at that small hand around his finger like he could not believe it was allowed. And when the preacher asked the question, the big man didn't hesitate. He'd had 9 years of cold and 3 nights of watching a fire by a river and 1 whole winter of a warm cabin to make up his mind, and he said it the same way he'd said it down in the frozen river bottom, plain and gentle and final. I will. I have thought about those 2 words my whole long life. I have heard men say them at altars and not mean them. I have heard them said grand, with music behind them. But I never heard them mean what they meant in that river bottom, said by a man with his hat in his hand to a woman who'd been told no by everyone she'd asked. Because here's what I came to understand slow over a lot of years. Anybody can say no. No is the easy word. No keeps your fire to yourself and your room empty and your winter manageable. The whole town of Cold Fork said no, and every one of them had a good reason, and not a single one of those reasons would have kept those children warm. It took the one man who'd already paid the full price of no, who'd come home once to a cold house and a fresh grave, to understand what it costs. And it was that man, who had the most reason of anyone to never open his door again, who came down the mountain and opened it. The Doyle widow lived to be an old woman. So did Silas Vance, longer than anybody expected of a man who'd lived so hard. I knew them both the rest of their lives. The boy took over the trapline and then a proper ranch down the valley. The girl married a doctor and named her first son Silas. And the cabin up Bitter Creek had smoke coming from its chimney, good thick smoke, every winter for 40 years. I'm an old man now, older than Vance ever got. And when the cold comes down the valley at night and rattles my shutters the way it rattled them when I was 12, I still think about that river bottom, and a woman whispering the saddest true thing she knew, and a mountain man taking off his hat. She said nobody would take them. One man heard her, and one was enough.